Welcome to the Long Road Stories. Tonight we bring you three deeply disturbing true stories about eyeless hitchhikers who appeared on American highways, encounters that pushed truckers to the absolute limits of sanity and challenged everything they believed about reality. Before we begin, subscribe and comment below telling us what state or country you're watching from. Now let's dive into three stories that will haunt your nightmares. The Sockets. What would you do if you picked up two hitchhikers on a lonely highway at midnight, and when they turned to look at you in the dome light, you saw that their eye sockets were completely empty, with nothing but dark, hollow cavities where their eyes should be, yet somehow they could see you perfectly and began describing your death in specific detail, and every single prediction they made started coming true exactly as they said. Thomas Garrett had been driving 18-wheelers across the southwestern United States for 31 years, hauling everything from construction materials to frozen foods across the endless deserts of Arizona, New Mexico, and Texas. He was 56 years old, a divorced father of 3 grown children, and he had seen just about everything the road had to offer during his 3 decades behind the wheel. Thomas prided himself on being rational, skeptical, and completely immune to the superstitions and ghost stories that many truckers shared at rest stops during the long, lonely nights. He had never believed in the supernatural, had never experienced anything he could not explain with logic and reason, and he considered himself a man of science who trusted only in what he could see, touch, and verify. But on one particular August night in the New Mexico desert, Thomas encountered something so profoundly disturbing and inexplicable that it shattered his entire worldview and left him questioning the fundamental nature of reality itself. It was 11:45 at night when Thomas was driving east on Highway 60 through one of the most isolated stretches of desert in New Mexico, an area so remote that he often went hours without seeing another vehicle or any sign of human civilization. His headlights cut through the absolute darkness like knives through black velvet, revealing nothing but empty highway stretching endlessly toward a horizon that seemed impossibly far away. The temperature outside had dropped to a comfortable 68 degrees, and Thomas had his window cracked to let in the cool desert air that smelled of sage and sand. He was hauling a load of industrial equipment from Phoenix to Albuquerque, running slightly ahead of schedule and feeling good about making his delivery with time to spare. The radio had lost signal miles back, leaving him alone with only the rumble of his diesel engine and the rhythmic sound of tires on pavement to break the profound silence of the desert night. That's when Thomas saw them standing on the shoulder of the highway, illuminated briefly by his approaching headlights, 2 figures with their thumbs extended in the universal gesture for hitchhiking. As Thomas got closer, he could see they appeared to be a man and a woman, both dressed in ordinary clothing that looked slightly dusty and worn, standing perfectly still beside an old duffel bag. Thomas normally never picked up hitchhikers due to safety concerns and insurance liability, but something about this situation struck him as genuinely concerning. They were in the middle of absolute nowhere, at least 40 miles from the nearest town in either direction, with no broken-down vehicle visible anywhere and no logical explanation for how these 2 people had ended up stranded in such a remote location. The temperature would drop into the 40s within a few hours, and leaving them out here could potentially be a death sentence if no one else came along to help. Thomas made a decision that would haunt him for the rest of his life. He gradually slowed his truck and pulled onto the wide shoulder, engaging his hazard lights and bringing the massive vehicle to a complete stop approximately 30 yards past where the hitchhikers were standing. He watched in his mirrors as the 2 figures picked up their duffel bag and began walking toward his truck, moving with oddly synchronized steps as if they were connected by invisible strings. Thomas leaned over and opened the passenger door from inside, calling out to ask if they needed a ride to the next town. The man responded in a voice that sounded perfectly normal and grateful, saying they had been stranded for several hours after their car broke down and was towed, and they desperately needed to get to Albuquerque, where they had family who could help them. The woman climbed into the passenger seat first, and the man followed, positioning himself in the middle so they were both squeezed into the single passenger seat designed for one person. Thomas thought this arrangement was odd, but not impossible, and he was about to turn on the dome light to get a better look at his passengers when the woman spoke and told him not to bother with the light, that they were fine sitting in the darkness and preferred not to have bright lights in their eyes after standing in the dark desert for so long. Thomas found this request unusual but reasonable, and he pulled back onto the highway without ever getting a clear look at their faces. For the first 20 minutes of the drive, the three of them made small talk about the weather, the isolation of the desert, and the challenges of being stranded in such a remote location. The man and woman seemed perfectly normal, articulate, and appreciative of Thomas's kindness in stopping to help them. Then, the woman said something that made Thomas's blood run cold. She said in a voice that was suddenly different, flatter and more mechanical, that Thomas should know they could see him very clearly, even though he could not see them, and that what they could see was very interesting because they could not only see his present form, but also his future form, and his future was approaching much faster than he realized. Thomas felt his hands tighten on the steering wheel as he asked what she meant by that, and the man spoke up, saying in that same flat mechanical voice that Thomas would die in exactly 47 days on October 2nd at approximately 3:30 in the afternoon in a traffic accident on Interstate 40 near Amarillo, Texas, when a tire would blow on his truck, causing him to lose control and roll the vehicle into the median where the cab would be crushed, and he would be killed instantly. Thomas felt panic rising in his chest as he reached over to turn on the dome light, needing to see who these people were and what kind of sick game they were playing. The moment the light came on, Thomas saw their faces clearly for the first time, and what he saw made him nearly lose control of his truck in sheer horror. Both the man and the woman had completely empty eye sockets, dark hollow cavities where their eyes should have been, with nothing visible inside except blackness that seemed to extend impossibly far back into their skulls. There were no eyelids, no damaged tissue, no signs of injury or surgery, just smooth skin transitioning directly into circular voids that looked like tunnels leading into another dimension. And despite having no eyes whatsoever, both of them were staring directly at Thomas with their empty sockets, tracking his movements with perfect precision as if they could see him better than people with normal vision. Thomas slammed on his brakes, bringing his truck to a sudden stop on the highway shoulder, and he shouted at them to get out of his vehicle immediately. The eyeless hitchhikers did not argue or protest. They simply opened the door, grabbed their duffel bag, and climbed down from the cab with movements that were too smooth and coordinated for people who supposedly had no vision. Before they walked away into the darkness, the woman turned back and said that Thomas should believe what they told him about his death, that they had seen it clearly in the timeline that exists beyond normal perception, and that he had 47 days to make peace with his fate, or try to change it if he thought he could alter what they had witnessed. Then both figures walked off the highway into the desert, moving with perfect confidence through terrain that should have been impossible to navigate without sight, and within seconds they had disappeared completely into the darkness, leaving no trace of their presence except the lingering smell of dust and something else, something chemical and wrong that Thomas could not identify. Thomas sat in his truck for nearly 30 minutes, trembling and trying to process what had just happened. He checked his passenger seat for any physical evidence that the hitchhikers had been real, and he found several grains of sand and a small amount of dust that proved someone had definitely been sitting there. Thomas considered calling the police to report what he had seen, but what would he tell them? That he had picked up two people with no eyes who predicted his death? They would think he was insane or on something illegal, and he would probably lose his commercial driver's license if they decided he was mentally unfit to operate a truck. Thomas eventually continued driving to Albuquerque, delivered his load on schedule, and tried to convince himself that the entire encounter had been some kind of hallucination brought on by fatigue or dehydration or some other rational explanation that his mind could accept. But the predictions began coming true almost immediately. The eyeless woman had mentioned several specific events that would happen to Thomas in the days and weeks following their encounter, things she claimed she could see in his timeline. She said he would receive a phone call from his eldest daughter on August 19th, informing him that she was pregnant with her first baby, and on August 19th, exactly as predicted, his daughter called with that exact news. The woman had said Thomas would be offered a promotion to dispatcher on August 27th, and on that exact date, his company offered him that exact position. She had said he would witness a serious accident on September 8th involving a motorcycle and a pickup truck on Highway 40, and on September 8th, Thomas saw that exact accident occur right in front of him, with a motorcyclist clipping a pickup truck and being thrown onto the highway, where he suffered severe injuries. Every single prediction the eyeless woman had made was coming true with perfect accuracy, which meant that her final prediction about Thomas dying on October 2nd in a truck accident near Amarillo was also likely to be true. Thomas became increasingly anxious and paranoid as the date approached, and he considered simply not driving on October 2nd, thinking that if he was not on the road that day, he could not possibly die in a truck accident. But the eyeless hitchhikers had been so specific about the time and location, and Thomas could not shake the feeling that fate or destiny or whatever force governed these predictions would find a way to make it happen regardless of what precautions he took. He began to obsess over every detail of truck maintenance, checking his tires constantly, inspecting his brakes multiple times per day, and driving far more cautiously than usual, hoping that extra vigilance might prevent the predicted accident from occurring. As October 2nd approached, Thomas made a decision that seemed rational at the time, but would have consequences he never anticipated. He called his dispatcher and said he was taking that entire day off, that he was not feeling well and needed a personal day to rest and recover. His dispatcher approved the request without question, and Thomas felt a surge of relief, thinking that by staying home and not driving at all on October 2nd, he could avoid the fate that the eyeless hitchhikers had predicted. October 2nd arrived, and Thomas stayed in his small apartment in Tucson, Arizona, watching television and trying not to think about the prediction. 3:30 in the afternoon came and went, and Thomas was still alive and safe in his home, and he began to feel a sense of triumph, believing he had successfully cheated fate and proven that the predictions were not as inevitable as they seemed. But at 3:45, Thomas received a phone call from his company dispatcher, and the man's voice was shaking as he delivered devastating news. Another driver from their company, a man named David Morrison, who was filling in for Thomas on what should have been his route that day, had been killed 15 minutes earlier in a catastrophic accident on Interstate 40 near Amarillo, Texas. A tire had blown on his truck at approximately 3:30 in the afternoon, causing him to lose control and roll the vehicle into the median where the cab was crushed, and he died instantly, in exactly the manner and at exactly the time and location that the eyeless hitchhikers had predicted for Thomas. Another man had died in Thomas's place, taking on the fate that had been predicted for him, and Thomas realized with horror that by trying to avoid his own death, he had inadvertently caused someone else to die instead. Thomas collapsed to his knees in his apartment, overwhelmed by guilt and horror, and the realization that the eyeless hitchhikers had been right about everything except the final crucial detail of who would actually die. Thomas attended David Morrison's funeral and met his widow and his 2 young children, and he carried the crushing weight of knowing that David had died because Thomas had tried to cheat fate. Thomas spent months in therapy, trying to process the trauma and guilt, and his therapist suggested that perhaps the eyeless hitchhikers had been showing Thomas one possible timeline, and by making different choices, he had shifted into a different timeline where someone else bore the consequences. But Thomas could never shake the feeling that he had committed some kind of cosmic theft, stealing years of life that were meant to end on October 2nd and causing an innocent man to pay the price. Thomas eventually quit trucking entirely, unable to drive without thinking about David Morrison and the Eyeless hitchhikers and the predictions that had come true with such terrible accuracy. He took a job as a warehouse manager, staying off the highways and avoiding the long, lonely roads where impossible things could happen. But sometimes late at night, Thomas would dream about the eyeless hitchhikers, and in his dreams, their empty sockets would fill with swirling images of possible futures, showing him hundreds of different timelines and different deaths and different versions of himself making different choices. And the eyeless woman would always say the same thing in these dreams, that seeing the future is a curse, not a gift, because knowing what will happen does not give you the power to change it. Only the burden of living with that knowledge and wondering if your attempts to alter fate will cause even greater suffering than simply accepting what is meant to be. Thomas Garrett lived the rest of his life haunted by the encounter with the eyeless hitchhikers and the death of David Morrison, never finding peace or absolution for the choice he made to stay home on October 2nd. He researched reports of similar encounters and found scattered stories from other truckers who claimed to have picked up hitchhikers with empty eye sockets who could somehow see perfectly and made predictions about the future. But none of these stories were ever verified or documented in any official way. Thomas kept a photograph of David Morrison in his wallet, a reminder of the man who died in his place, and he donated money every month to David's family to help support his children as they grew up without a father. The eyeless hitchhikers were never seen again on Highway 60 in New Mexico, or if they were, no one reported the encounters publicly, leaving Thomas to wonder if they still walked those lonely desert roads, offering glimpses of terrible futures to drivers who made the mistake of stopping to help stranded strangers in the darkness. Comment your state or country and tell us the most haunted stretch of road near you. The best ones might appear in the next episode. The stolen sight. Imagine driving through a specific stretch of highway at night where people with no eyes repeatedly flag down trucks asking for rides, and every single trucker who stops to help them wakes up the next morning completely blind with their eyes surgically removed while they slept. And the eyeless cult is growing larger every week, desperately needing more sight to see into the afterlife, and they will take yours whether you agree or not. Rachel Kim was a 42-year-old independent owner-operator who had been driving trucks professionally for 18 years, specializing in overnight deliveries across the Pacific Northwest. Rachel had purchased her own truck 7 years earlier and built a solid reputation for reliability and professionalism, earning enough to support herself comfortably and save for an eventual retirement. She was Korean-American, born in Seattle, raised in Portland, and she loved the independence and solitude that long-haul trucking provided. Rachel was practical, cautious, and highly aware of the dangers that truckers faced on the road, from aggressive drivers to equipment failures to the occasional criminal who targeted isolated truckers at rest stops. But nothing in her 18 years of experience had prepared her for what she would encounter on Highway 97 in Central Oregon, a route she had driven hundreds of times without incident, until one September night when everything changed in the most horrifying way imaginable. Rachel was driving north on Highway 97 at approximately 2:30 in the morning, hauling a load of electronics from California to Washington, when she saw the first one standing on the shoulder of the road. It was a woman who appeared to be in her 30s, wearing dirty clothing and waving both arms frantically as if she desperately needed help. Rachel's headlights illuminated the woman's face for just a moment as she passed, and Rachel felt her heart skip a beat because something was very wrong with the woman's face, something that Rachel's brain could not quite process in the brief instant of visibility. Rachel's instinct was to keep driving, following the safety protocols she had always maintained about not stopping for strangers in isolated areas. but her conscience nagged at her, suggesting that someone might genuinely need help and that abandoning them could be a death sentence. Rachel made it another 5 miles before her guilt became overwhelming, and she decided to turn around and go back to check on the woman, at least to call authorities if medical help was needed. She found a safe place to turn her truck around, and she drove slowly back toward the location where she had seen the woman, scanning the shoulder carefully with her high beams. The woman was still there, standing in exactly the same position, still waving her arms with that same desperate gesture. Rachel brought her truck to a complete stop approximately 20 yards away, and she grabbed her flashlight and her phone before stepping down from her cab to approach the woman on foot, keeping a safe distance and preparing to run back to her truck if anything seemed dangerous. As Rachel got closer with her flashlight beam pointed at the woman's face, she saw the horrifying truth that her brain had refused to process during the initial pass. The woman had no eyes whatsoever, just smooth skin where her eyes should have been, as if someone had surgically sealed her eyelids shut and removed every trace of her eyeballs. There were no scars, no stitches, no signs of trauma, just an impossible smooth expanse of skin across the area where eyes normally existed. And despite having no eyes, the woman turned to face Rachel directly, tracking her movements with perfect accuracy, and spoke in a voice that was hoarse and desperate, saying she needed help getting to a safe place, that she had been attacked and needed to reach a hospital as quickly as possible. Rachel felt every instinct screaming at her to run back to her truck and drive away as fast as possible. But the woman seemed genuinely terrified and helpless, and Rachel could not bring herself to abandon someone who appeared to be a victim of some horrific attack. Rachel told the woman to walk toward her truck and climb into the passenger seat, and Rachel would drive her to the nearest hospital, which was approximately 35 miles north in Bend, Oregon. The eyeless woman agreed and walked toward the truck with movements that were far too confident and coordinated for someone who supposedly could not see, and Rachel felt her anxiety increasing with every step. As the woman climbed into the passenger seat, Rachel noticed several other figures standing further back from the highway, partially hidden in the shadows of the tree line, and all of them appeared to have the same smooth, eyeless faces, and they were all watching Rachel with their empty faces pointed directly at her. Rachel jumped into her truck quickly and locked the doors, her heart pounding with genuine fear as she realized she might have made a terrible mistake. The eyeless woman sitting in her passenger seat turned to face her and said in a voice that was no longer desperate or afraid, but cold and emotionless, that Rachel should not be frightened, that what was about to happen was necessary for the greater purpose, and that Rachel's sight would be used well by those who needed to see beyond the veil of death into the realms that exist after life ends. Rachel slammed her truck into gear and tried to accelerate away, but before she could get the vehicle moving, she felt a sharp pain in her neck, like a needle being inserted, and within seconds her vision began to blur, and her consciousness started fading as some kind of fast-acting sedative took effect. The last thing Rachel saw before everything went black was the eyeless woman's smooth face leaning close to hers, and more figures with no eyes climbing into her truck cab through doors Rachel had thought were locked. Rachel woke up an indeterminate amount of time later, lying in her truck's sleeper berth, feeling groggy and disoriented with a pounding headache that made it difficult to think clearly. She tried to open her eyes to assess her situation, but nothing happened. No light reached her consciousness, no images formed in her brain, only complete and total darkness. Rachel reached up to touch her face, and her hands confirmed her worst fear. Where her eyes should have been, there was only smooth skin, exactly like the woman she had picked up on Highway 97. Someone had surgically removed her eyes while she was unconscious, sealing the empty sockets with a technique that left no scars, no stitches, no evidence of the procedure except the complete absence of her eyeballs and her vision. Rachel screamed and thrashed in blind panic, and she felt hands grabbing her arms, multiple people holding her down, and a voice spoke close to her ear. It was the eyeless woman from the highway, and she explained in that same cold, emotionless tone that Rachel should calm down and accept what had happened, that her eyes were gone and would never be returned, but that Rachel would learn to navigate without sight, just as all the others had learned. The woman explained that they were members of something she called the Collective of the Blind, a group that had discovered through experimentation and spiritual practice that the human soul's ability to perceive the afterlife and the realms beyond death could only be activated by removing the physical eyes that kept consciousness anchored to the material world. By taking sight from others, the collective members could temporarily use those stolen eyes as windows into the death realms, allowing them to communicate with deceased loved ones and explore the landscapes that awaited all humans after their physical bodies ceased to function. The eyeless woman said that Rachel's eyes were particularly valuable because Rachel had never used glasses or contacts, meaning her vision had been perfect and undamaged, and the collective's lead seers could use Rachel's eyes to see deeper into the afterlife than they had ever been able to see before. Rachel would remain with the collective for several days, the woman explained, while they tested her stolen eyes and extracted as much vision as possible from them, and then Rachel would be released to live whatever life she could manage without sight, joining the growing number of people across the Pacific Northwest who had encountered the collective and paid the price of stopping to help eyeless strangers on isolated highways. Rachel begged them to return her eyes, offering money, offering anything, but the eyeless woman said the removal was permanent and irreversible, that Rachel's eyes no longer existed in a form that could be reinstalled into her sockets, even if the collective wanted to return them, which they did not. Rachel was held captive for 6 days in a location she could not see or identify, surrounded by eyeless cult members who spoke in whispers about the visions they were receiving through her stolen sight. They described seeing vast landscapes of light and shadow, hearing voices of the dead calling out across infinite distances, and witnessing the moment of death from the perspective of those who had already crossed over. Rachel's eyes, they said, were among the clearest windows into the afterlife they had ever possessed, and they were grateful to her for providing such valuable sight, even if she had not given it willingly. On the 7th day, Rachel was loaded back into her truck, which had been driven to a different location, and the eyeless woman told her that she was being released, that her eyes had served their purpose, and Rachel was now free to return to whatever life she could manage without vision. Rachel felt her truck being parked, heard the doors open and close, and after several minutes of silence, she carefully felt her way out of the sleeper berth and into the driver's seat. She found her cell phone by memory and feel, and she managed to call 911 by using the voice assistant function. Police and paramedics arrived within 20 minutes, and they found Rachel sitting in her truck in a rest area off Highway 97, blind and traumatized, telling a story about an eyeless cult that stole people's sight to see into the afterlife. The authorities were skeptical at first, assuming Rachel had been the victim of some kind of conventional attack. But when they examined her face and saw the impossible smooth skin where her eyes had been, with no scarring or evidence of surgical procedure, they began to take her claims more seriously. The Oregon State Police launched an investigation into Rachel's case and discovered she was not the only victim. Over the previous 18 months, 7 other people had reported being attacked on Highway 97 and waking up blind, with their eyes removed in the same impossible surgical manner, and another 4 people had reported seeing eyeless hitchhikers on that same highway, but had not stopped to help them. The investigation found no physical evidence of the collective of the blind, no abandoned facilities, no surgical equipment, no harvested eyes, nothing that could lead to arrests or prosecution. Rachel received medical care and began the long process of learning to navigate life without sight, adapting to a world she could no longer see, supported by disability benefits and the compensation from selling her truck, which she could no longer operate. She participated in support groups for blind individuals, though she never shared the true story of how she lost her sight, knowing that no one would believe the impossible truth. And sometimes Rachel would hear other blind people describing dreams where they could see again, vivid dreams of visions beyond normal human perception, dreams of deceased loved ones and afterlife landscapes, and Rachel would wonder if some of those people were also victims of the collective, carriers of stolen sight that occasionally leaked through into their sleeping consciousness, giving them glimpses of the realms that the Eyeless cult members were so desperate to explore. The vision feeders. Picture yourself driving through the night when you pick up a seemingly normal hitchhiker who makes pleasant conversation for hours until you notice in your peripheral vision that your passenger's empty eye sockets are slowly filling up with images of everything you have ever seen, as if this entity is consuming your memories through eye contact, stealing your entire visual history and leaving you with nothing but blank spaces where your experiences used to be. Carlos Mendoza was a 38-year-old truck driver who specialized in long-haul cross-country routes, spending weeks at a time on the road, traveling from coast to coast, delivering specialized cargo for companies that required reliable and discreet transportation. Carlos had been driving professionally for 14 years, and he considered the truck his real home, more comfortable in the cab than in the small apartment he rented in Denver, where he spent only a few days per month between long trips. Carlos was bilingual, speaking fluent English and Spanish, and he had grown up in El Paso, Texas, as the son of immigrant parents who had worked hard to give him opportunities they never had. He was philosophical and introspective by nature, spending his long hours on the road, listening to audiobooks about history, philosophy, and science, always trying to expand his knowledge and understanding of the world. But on one particular November night, driving through the empty plains of Kansas, Carlos encountered something that challenged his entire understanding of consciousness, memory, and the nature of human experience in ways that would leave him permanently changed. It was 11:20 at night when Carlos saw the hitchhiker standing beside Interstate 70 in the middle of rural Kansas, miles from any town or rest stop. The figure was illuminated briefly by Carlos's headlights and appeared to be a young man in his mid-20s, dressed in ordinary jeans and a jacket, holding a small backpack and extending his thumb in the traditional hitchhiking gesture. Carlos normally did not pick up hitchhikers, following the industry's standard safety protocols, but something about this particular situation made him reconsider. The temperature outside was dropping toward freezing. There was a storm system moving in from the north that would bring heavy snow within hours, and leaving someone stranded in these conditions could be genuinely life-threatening. Carlos made a split-second decision to pull over, telling himself he would at least offer the young man a ride to the next truck stop, where there would be warmth and shelter. The hitchhiker jogged up to Carlos's truck and climbed into the passenger seat, thanking Carlos profusely for stopping and explaining that his car had broken down miles back and been towed, leaving him stranded in the freezing Kansas night. The young man introduced himself as Marcus, and he seemed perfectly normal and friendly, asking Carlos about his route and his experiences as a trucker. They fell into easy conversation, discussing everything from the challenges of long-haul driving to their favorite books and movies, and Carlos found himself enjoying the company after days of driving alone. Marcus was intelligent and articulate, asking thoughtful questions and sharing interesting perspectives on various topics, and Carlos thought he seemed like exactly the kind of low-risk passenger that made stopping for hitchhikers occasionally worthwhile. After approximately 40 minutes of pleasant conversation, Carlos glanced over at his passenger and noticed something unusual about Marcus's appearance. In the dim light from the dashboard, Marcus's face looked slightly off in a way Carlos could not immediately identify. Something about the shadows around his eyes seemed wrong. Carlos turned on the dome light to get a better look, and what he saw made his stomach drop. Marcus's eye sockets were empty, containing no eyeballs whatsoever, just dark, hollow spaces where eyes should be. But unlike other reports of eyeless individuals that Carlos would later hear about, Marcus's empty sockets were not simply voids. They were filled with swirling movement, like television static or white noise made visible, with thousands of tiny, flickering images cascading through the empty spaces, as if Marcus's head was somehow projecting visual content directly into the cavities where his eyes should have been. Carlos nearly drove off the road in shock, and he immediately demanded to know what Marcus was and what was happening. Marcus's demeanor changed instantly, his friendly conversational tone replaced by something colder and more clinical. Marcus explained that he was not human, not in the traditional sense, but rather a type of entity that existed on the borderlands between physical matter and pure consciousness. Marcus said that entities like him needed to consume visual experiences to maintain their existence, that they fed on the memories and perceptions stored in human brains, and that hitchhiking was the most efficient method of accessing the concentrated visual experiences that truck drivers accumulated during their years on the road. Every image Carlos had ever seen, Marcus explained, every memory of landscapes and faces and moments was currently being extracted from Carlos's neural pathways and transferred into Marcus's empty sockets, where it would be consumed and integrated into the entity's consciousness. Carlos felt a wave of dizziness wash over him as he realized his vision was becoming less vivid and detailed, as if someone was turning down the saturation and contrast on his perception. He tried to look away from Marcus, to break whatever connection was allowing this extraction to occur, but Marcus calmly explained that eye contact was not necessary for the process, that it had begun the moment Carlos agreed to give Marcus a ride and would continue until the extraction was complete or until Carlos forced Marcus out of the vehicle. Carlos slammed on his brakes and shouted at Marcus to get out immediately, but Marcus made no move to leave, sitting calmly in the passenger seat while the swirling images in his eye sockets grew more vivid and detailed as they filled with everything Carlos had ever seen. Carlos could feel his memories becoming less accessible, like trying to remember dreams that slip away moments after waking. Specific visual memories that he had cherished for years, images of his parents' faces, his first truck, scenic vistas from memorable drives, all of these were becoming fuzzy and indistinct, as if they were being erased or copied over with blank space. Marcus explained almost apologetically that this was simply how entities like him survived, that they were not evil or malicious, but merely following their nature, consuming visual experiences from humans the way humans consume nutrients from food. Marcus said that Carlos would not die from this extraction, but he would be left with significant memory gaps and reduced visual recall, essentially losing his ability to remember what things looked like, even if he could still remember that they had existed. Carlos did something that surprised both himself and Marcus. Instead of continuing to panic or trying to physically fight an entity that was clearly not bound by normal physical laws, Carlos asked Marcus to explain more about what he was and why these entities needed human visual experiences. Marcus seemed pleased by the question, and he launched into an explanation that was both fascinating and terrifying. He said that entities like him existed in a realm where vision did not occur naturally, where consciousness existed without physical senses, and they experienced an intense curiosity about what it was like to see the physical world through eyes. They could not generate vision themselves, could not understand colors or shapes or visual beauty through their own existence, so they found ways to extract these experiences from beings who possessed sight, humans being the most accessible and abundant source. Marcus said there were thousands of his kind scattered across North America, all of them hitchhiking or finding other ways to get close enough to humans to extract visual memories. Some extracted slowly over days or weeks of casual contact, while others, like Marcus, preferred to extract everything at once in a single concentrated session. Marcus said he had consumed the visual experiences of over 200 humans during his time in this realm, and each extraction added to his growing understanding of what it meant to see the world through eyes. He described it almost like an art form, collecting and appreciating different people's visual perspectives, noting how a trucker's accumulated road experiences differed from a photographer's curated images or a parent's memory collection of their children growing up. As Marcus spoke, Carlos watched in horrified fascination as his own visual memories played out in Marcus's eye sockets like miniature movie screens. He could see himself as a child, playing in his parents' backyard in El Paso, could see the face of his first love from 20 years earlier, could see sunsets and storms and cities and highways all flickering past in rapid succession as Marcus consumed everything Carlos had witnessed during his 38 years of life. The experience was surreal and deeply disturbing, watching his own memories being stolen and displayed in empty cavities in another being's face, knowing that these images were being taken from him permanently and he would never be able to recall them with the same clarity and detail again. Carlos asked Marcus what would happen to him after the extraction was complete, whether he would still be able to drive trucks and live his life despite the memory loss. Marcus said that Carlos would retain his general knowledge and skills, would still know how to drive and how to function in the world, but his episodic visual memories would be severely degraded, leaving him with only vague impressions of what specific people and places and moments had looked like. Marcus said some humans adapted well to this loss, treating it like a form of visual amnesia and learning to live in the present moment without dwelling on past images, while others became deeply depressed by the loss of their visual history and struggled to find meaning in a life where they could not remember what their loved ones' faces looked like or what beautiful moments they had witnessed. The extraction process lasted for nearly 2 hours, with Carlos sitting paralyzed in his stopped truck on the shoulder of Interstate 70, while Marcus systematically consumed every visual memory Carlos had accumulated during his lifetime. Carlos felt like he was dying in a strange way, not physically but experientially, as if the person he had been was being erased and replaced with a hollow shell that knew facts but could not remember images. When the process finally ended, Marcus's eye sockets were filled with swirling, brilliant displays of colors and shapes and faces. All of Carlos's stolen visual experiences integrated into whatever passed for Marcus's consciousness. Marcus thanked Carlos for the meal, describing it almost like a compliment to a chef, saying that Carlos's visual memories were particularly rich and well-maintained, full of appreciation for natural beauty and human connection, and that Marcus would treasure these experiences and use them to better understand what it meant to be a seeing creature. Marcus opened the passenger door and climbed down from the truck, and before he walked away into the darkness, he turned back and said something that Carlos would never forget. Marcus said that in a strange way, Carlos's visual experiences would live forever now, preserved in Marcus's consciousness long after Carlos's physical body died and decayed, and that there was a kind of immortality in being consumed this way, having your perspective on the world appreciated and remembered by an entity that existed outside normal time and death. Marcus said that someday, perhaps centuries from now, another entity might extract memories from Marcus and would inherit Carlos's visual experiences as part of that extraction, creating a chain of consumed consciousness that could theoretically extend forever, with Carlos's way of seeing the world propagating through countless beings across time and space. Then Marcus walked away from the highway into the empty Kansas plains, and Carlos watched him go, noticing that his own visual perception felt flat and colorless now, as if someone had removed a filter that made the world vibrant and beautiful. Carlos sat in his truck for over an hour, trying to remember what his mother's face looked like in detail, trying to recall the exact appearance of memorable sunsets he had witnessed, and finding only vague impressions where specific images used to be. He discovered he could still drive safely, his motor skills and spatial awareness intact, but the joy of seeing new landscapes and interesting sights was gone, replaced by a functional but emotionally empty experience of processing visual input without the rich context of visual memory to compare it to. Carlos completed his delivery to his destination in Colorado, and then he drove back to Denver, where he met with neurologists and psychologists to describe what had happened to him. Brain scans showed unusual activity in the visual cortex and memory centers, patterns that the doctors had never seen before and could not explain with conventional neuroscience. Carlos found other people online who described similar experiences of memory loss and encounters with eyeless hitchhikers, and he realized he was part of a growing population of humans who had been used as food sources by entities that existed in the margins of reality, feeding on experiences that humans took for granted, but that these beings valued above all else. Carlos continued driving trucks for several more years, though the work had lost much of its meaning and satisfaction now that he could not appreciate or remember the visual beauty of the places he traveled. He kept detailed written journals describing everything he saw, trying to compensate for his lost visual memory by creating text-based records of his experiences. But reading descriptions of sunsets and mountains was a poor substitute for actually remembering what they looked like. And sometimes, Carlos would wonder if Marcus was still out there somewhere, still hitchhiking and consuming visual memories, and whether some part of Carlos's perspective on the world was still alive inside Marcus's consciousness, seeing through memories that Carlos himself could no longer access. Carlos Mendoza eventually retired from trucking at age 45, unable to continue a career that had been built on appreciating the visual experiences of the open road when those experiences no longer brought him joy or created lasting memories. He worked various jobs that did not require extensive travel, living a quiet life that felt emotionally muted compared to the rich visual existence he remembered having before meeting Marcus. Carlos never saw Marcus or any other vision-feeding entity again, though he remained convinced that they were common on America's highways, feeding on isolated travelers who made the mistake of offering rides to hitchhikers who seemed human, but were actually something far stranger. The empty eye sockets filling with stolen memories remained Carlos's most vivid remaining visual memory, preserved perhaps because it was so disturbing that it burned itself into his consciousness in a way the entities could not fully extract, a reminder that the world contained predators that fed on experiences rather than flesh, and that the price of compassion toward strangers could sometimes be the loss of everything that made your life worth remembering. Thank you for watching The Long Road Stories. Subscribe for more true highway encounters and comment telling us where you're watching from. The highways are full of things that should not exist, and we'll be back soon with more stories from the dark roads.